She was just walking down the street, minding her own business, when a cop slammed into her, no warning, no reason. She had no idea it would be the last time anyone would let him get away with it. What happened next would shake a city to its core and leave a career in ruins. But the most shocking part? It wasn't just about the police officer, it was about what happened when the governor showed up. What did he know, and why did it change everything? Stay tuned to find out. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Tasha lived a life that many could relate to. At 17, she was full of dreams of escaping her small town, getting out of the daily grind, and making a life for herself. She spent most of her days at the local library, devouring books on business and tech, imagining a future where she could change the world. Her nights were spent with her friends, laughing about school, talking about the future, and creating memories in the little moments that made up her normal life. She wasn't perfect, of course. She had her fair share of frustrations, some with school, some with her parents, but nothing that felt beyond her control. Life was hard, but it was predictable, and Tasha liked it that way. She had plans. Big plans. And, like any teenager, she loved to take walks, just to clear her head. On this particular evening, she was on her usual route home, strolling down a quiet street, earbuds in, humming along to a song she'd heard 100 times before. It was just an ordinary night. Or, at least, it should have been. As she passed the corner near the park, a police car pulled up beside her. Tasha barely looked up, thinking nothing of it. This was a quiet neighborhood. The officers were just doing their job, keeping things calm. At least, that's what she'd always believed, until that moment. The officer stepped out of the car with a tense look on his face. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there, eyeing her as if he was waiting for something. Tasha pulled the earbuds out, confused. Her heart began to race a little, she didn't know why, but there was something about the way he was looking at her that didn't feel right. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound casual. For a split second, there was silence. Then, without warning, the officer took a step forward, blocking her path. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp and unyielding. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? She was just walking home, like anyone else. Was she being stopped just for being out on the street? The thought hit her hard. But she pushed it aside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a routine stop. She tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. But as the officer took another step closer, her gut told her this wasn't a routine stop. Not at all. What was coming was about to change everything for Tasha, and not just for her, but for an entire community. Tasha stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The officer's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unblinking. He was a tall man, maybe in his mid-30s, with a square jaw and a look that made her feel like a suspect even though she hadn't done anything wrong. The air between them was thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She tried to steady her breath. "Excuse me?" Tasha repeated, this time with a little more force in her voice. "I'm just walking home." But the officer didn't answer. Instead, he took another step toward her, closer now, too close for comfort. Tasha instinctively took a step back, her heart thumping. Why was he doing this? Why was he making it so uncomfortable? "Where are you headed?" His tone was clipped, demanding. "Home," she replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm just walking back from the library." "Library?" The officer raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And where is that exactly?" Tasha felt her chest tighten. Something about the question made her uneasy. Was it just the way he said it, or did he already know? Was he trying to trip her up? "It's on the corner of Main and Elm," she answered, the words coming out more slowly now. She tried to keep her voice steady, but something about the way the officer was eyeing her made her feel like she was in a game she didn't understand. The officer's gaze flickered down to her feet, then up again, as if searching for something. Tasha couldn't tell if he was assessing her or just looking for an excuse. She wanted to leave, to get away from him, but she felt rooted to the spot. He took a step even closer, and the tension became unbearable. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, his voice flat. Tasha's stomach dropped. Description? What was he talking about? There had to be a mistake. "What description?" she asked, her voice shaking despite herself. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another step forward, reaching for his radio. Tasha's mind raced. Was this happening? Was she really being stopped like this for no reason? She tried to back away again, but the officer blocked her path. "Stay still," he ordered. Tasha felt the fight-or-flight instincts surge inside her. What was going on? Her mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. She had heard stories of things like this happening, of cops stopping people for no reason other than the way they looked. Was this what that felt like? She had never imagined it would be her, not like this. As she stood there, trying to figure out how to react, the officer's partner, a younger man with a goatee, joined him. The second officer didn't speak at first, just surveyed the scene with an almost disinterested look. Tasha couldn't help but feel small under their scrutiny, as if she were being judged for something she didn't even know she'd done. "Let me see your ID," the first officer said, his voice cutting through the silence. "ID?" Tasha repeated, bewildered. I didn't do anything wrong. Why do you need to see my ID?" "Just hand it over," the officer snapped, his patience running thin. Tasha swallowed hard. Was this really happening? Was she about to be treated like a criminal just for being on a public street? She was scared now, more scared than she'd ever been in her life. The tension was so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. I don't have it with me," she said, trying to stay calm. "I didn't think I needed it. I was just walking home." The officer's face hardened. "You should always have your ID on you. It's the law." Tasha felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't right. The second officer, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "Let's check the security footage," he suggested, his voice low and flat. Tasha turned to look at him, not sure if she heard him correctly. "What footage?" "The cameras around here," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We'll figure out what you were doing here." Tasha felt like the world was closing in on her. She had never felt more powerless in her life. The officers weren't just treating her like a suspect, they were treating her like she was guilty before she even had the chance to speak. And now, it was as if they were looking for evidence to confirm that guilt. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers didn't answer. They just exchanged looks, their silent communication making her feel even more isolated, as if she were standing in front of a wall that refused to let her through. The younger officer reached for his radio again, speaking into it briefly, and Tasha felt her stomach drop. What now? She thought about running, about making a break for it, but then she remembered her mom's warning, "If you run, it'll make things worse." Her mother had always said that, and part of her wanted to scream, to run far away from all of this. But another part of her, something deeper, reminded her that running wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would only make it worse. As she stood there, hands trembling, the sirens in the distance grew louder, and Tasha realized that what was happening wasn't just some mistake. It wasn't just an isolated incident. There were others. She wasn't the first. In that moment, something inside of her hardened, like a wall going up around her heart. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She was stronger than this. But how long could she stay strong before something broke? Just then, a car pulled up, and Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who was inside, but it didn't matter. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next would change everything. The officer's demeanor shifted as he stood straighter, his eyes narrowing at the incoming car. The car door opened, and out stepped a figure, a man, tall and imposing. He was wearing a tailored suit, and the look on his face told Tasha everything she needed to know. It was the governor. The tension in the air was suffocating. Tasha stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, as the governor walked toward her, his gaze hardening with every step. The officers looked at him nervously, a few glances exchanged between them, but they didn't move. "Governor, the officer tried to explain, but the governor cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't bother," the governor said, his voice cold and unwavering. He didn't even spare the officer a second glance as he focused on Tasha. "Are you all right?" His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it that sent a shiver through her. Tasha could barely believe it. The governor, the most powerful man in the state, was talking to her. Why? What did he have to do with this? "Yeah," she said, trying to steady her breath, but her voice wavered. I'm fine." The governor nodded, his gaze flicking back to the officers who were now visibly on edge. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. The older officer, the one who had first stopped Tasha, stepped forward, shifting uncomfortably under the governor's gaze. We received a call about a suspicious person. We were just." "A suspicious person," the governor interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Is that why you're harassing a teenager walking home? Is that your justification?" Tasha's breath hitched. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. The governor wasn't here by chance. He was here because this was bigger than her. This wasn't just some random cop who had made a mistake, it was something deeply embedded in the system. Something he couldn't ignore anymore. The officers stammered, trying to explain, but the governor wasn't having it. "You are a public servant," he snapped, his voice now biting. "And yet, you see a young black girl walking down the street and decide that's suspicious? What in God's name is wrong with you?" The second officer stepped forward, nervously tugging at his uniform. "Governor, we didn't mean any harm. We thought." "What you thought doesn't matter," the governor shouted, his voice booming in the quiet night. He turned to the first officer, his eyes locked in a cold, piercing stare. "You're supposed to serve and protect the people, not treat them like criminals because of the color of their skin." Tasha felt her chest tighten. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim of this moment. She wasn't alone in this fight. The governor, the man in charge, was standing up for her. The officers stood silent, their faces flushing with humiliation, as the governor continued to tear them down, exposing every flaw in their actions. But Tasha's mind was racing. She wasn't just relieved that the governor had intervened, she felt a surge of anger building inside her. How many times had this happened before? How many times had she been looked at like she was the problem, just for being who she was? She stepped forward, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, the words coming out like a declaration. "I was just walking home, and you," she pointed at the officers, her hand trembling with fury, "you stopped me like I was some kind of criminal. Like my life doesn't matter." The governor was silent for a moment, his eyes locked on Tasha. Then, he turned back to the officers, his gaze steely with resolve. "You're both suspended," he said flatly. "Effective immediately." The officers froze, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. What?" the first officer stammered. "You heard me," the governor said, his voice unwavering. "You're suspended. I'll have an internal investigation launched immediately. And if I hear one more report of you pulling stunts like this, I'll make sure you never wear a badge again." The second officer stepped back, looking like he was about to protest, but then thought better of it. Tasha watched as the officers, stunned and humiliated, turned and walked back to their car, heads hung low. They didn't look back. It was over. For now. But as the governor turned back to her, a cold realization settled in her chest. this wasn't the end. This wasn't just about her or the officers. This was about something much bigger. Her body trembled, the weight of what had just happened finally sinking in. The governor had done the right thing, but how long would it take for real change to happen? Was this just a temporary victory, or would this moment spark something larger? She wasn't backing down. And neither was anyone else who had been forced to stay silent for far too long. The following weeks were a blur for Tasha. The initial shock of the encounter with the officer seemed to wear off quickly, replaced by something much more powerful, a sense of purpose. What had started as an unfortunate incident had transformed into a movement, a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been stopped, harassed, or made to feel less than simply because of their skin. Tasha's story spread. News outlets picked it up, the footage from that night showing her standing tall against the officers, her voice trembling with frustration and determination. It was a rare, raw moment, one that resonated deeply with people who had faced similar injustices. The governor's swift actions to suspend the officers sent shockwaves through the community, and though it was a small victory, it was one that hadn't been won in a long time. People began talking about the systemic issues of racism that had been allowed to fester for years, even decades. But while the immediate effects of that night were dramatic, the long-term consequences would be felt much more deeply. The two officers, once confident in their unchecked authority, were soon investigated by the state's police review board. Their actions were thoroughly examined, and over the next few months, an internal audit revealed that both officers had been involved in several other complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. Their suspensions turned into firings, and their names were tarnished forever. However, that wasn't the end of the story for the larger issue at hand. The governor's office began receiving increasing pressure from civil rights organizations and community leaders to do more. The governor, once seen as a distant figure, became a symbol of accountability for some and a target for others. But Tasha's influence grew, too. She was invited to speak at rallies, at community events, and even before lawmakers. She refused to let the conversation stop with the officers who had harassed her. Instead, she turned her attention to the deeper, more insidious nature of the system that allowed these incidents to happen regularly. Tasha fought for police reform, for determination. It was a rare, raw moment, one that resonated deeply with people who had faced similar injustices. The governor's swift actions to suspend the officers sent shockwaves through the community, and though it was a small victory, it was one that hadn't been won in a long time. People began talking about the systemic issues of racism that had been allowed to fester for years, even decades. But while the immediate effects of that night were dramatic, the long-term consequences would be felt much more deeply. The two officers, once confident in their unchecked authority, were soon investigated by the state's police review board. Their actions were thoroughly examined, and over the next few months, an internal audit revealed that both officers had been involved in several other complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. Their suspensions turned into firings, and their names were tarnished forever. However, that wasn't the end of the story for the larger issue at hand. The governor's office began receiving increasing pressure from civil rights organizations and community leaders to do more. The governor, once seen as a distant figure, became a symbol of accountability for some and a target for others. But Tasha's influence grew, too. She was invited to speak at rallies, at community events, and even before lawmakers. She refused to let the conversation stop with the officers who had harassed her. Instead, she turned her attention to the deeper, more insidious nature of the system that allowed these incidents to happen regularly. Tasha fought for police reform, for transparency in law enforcement, and for an overhaul of how communities dealt with racial discrimination. She became a voice for the voiceless, the ones who had been silently suffering for too long. Through her efforts, the conversation about systemic racism grew louder. New policies were discussed, old practices were questioned, and it became clear that the state's approach to policing was due for a massive overhaul. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but changes began to take shape. More police officers underwent racial bias training, community outreach programs were established, and a special task force was created to review complaints of police misconduct. But while the laws began to change, something even more important started to shift: people's minds. Tasha's story had planted a seed in the hearts of many, reminding them that the fight for equality wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But the battle was far from over. Tasha understood that. She knew that systemic racism couldn't be erased with one incident, one story, one person. It would take years, decades even, to untangle the deep roots of prejudice embedded in society. But in that moment, she also realized that change was possible. Her actions, her courage, had started something much bigger than her. She had started a conversation that needed to continue. And as Tasha sat in the small coffee shop where it had all started, reflecting on how far she had come since that fateful night, she knew that she wasn't done. This was just the beginning. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a step toward dismantling the system of oppression. Every protest, every discussion, every piece of legislation passed, was a victory in a much larger war. Tasha had faced something she never thought she would, a confrontation that left her raw, exposed, and vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, she had found her strength. In that injustice, she had found her purpose. The strength of the human spirit wasn't just in surviving hardship, it was in the way people could turn their pain into purpose. It was in the way they could fight back against a broken system and refuse to be silenced.